Author Assist has been assisting authors since 2015. Everyone has a book inside of them. Are you ready to write yours? Author Assist offers affordable publishing packages for ebooks and paperbacks that don't cost $10,000. We have an extensive multimedia package that will improve your book's visibility. That includes a trailer created by an award-winning designer, a radio show that goes out live worldwide, and excerpt narrations. Author Assist also offers a fabulous mentoring and coaching package. Your mentor will set goals, discuss the publishing choices and your limitations. Coaching includes classes in design, promotion and marketing. Author Assist is the official graphic designer for GoIndieNow. And our podcast, Behind the Pen, has just gone to TV. Your book could be seen by a possible 150 million homes. Contact Author Assist. See how we can help you in your publishing journey.
The React structure is back, and we are setting the stage for another great season. Now that we have our stories and characters, we need somewhere for them to go, but not just anywhere. It needs to challenge and heighten their senses, provide the obstacles to overcome, and even within these settings, there has to lie structure. A 3-act structure.
Nikki Nelson Hicks. I write a lot of different things, speculative fiction, science fiction, steampunk, horror, basically anything I can kill someone, a lot of good murders involved. That's pretty much what I do. I have a great fun time doing that.
Hi, I'm Debra Parmley, and I also write a lot of different types of things. Most of y'all know me from writing a military romantic suspense, but I started out writing historical romance. And today I'll be talking about something new nobody knows that I write, and so just stay tuned for that.
I'm David Green. I write mostly fantasy, epic fantasy and urban fantasy these days, but I also ghostwrite, so I do a lot of things that no one knows that I have written, which I will probably talk about today.
Hey guys, I am Courtney, aka CL Cannon. I write mostly YA, sci-fi, and fantasy. A lot of it is set in Yore, a lot of fantasy settings that are medieval and things like that.
Hi, I'm Tim Niederitter. I write mostly fantasy these days, but most of my fantasy blends some science fiction there. But I have written a few books that are set in the old days, basically, technology-wise.
Let's start with the idea of Yore and kingdoms and creating the setting for that. I want to know from you all, what are essentials for you in this aesthetic? What do you need in this setting to kind of move your stories forward?
I need to know the year so that I can know what kind of technology we've got home, what kind of politics, if we are keeping this kind of real, historical. Most of the times I will use an historical thing just to have my template because I'm lazy. And if it's already there, I might as well use it.
I need to know where, the year in particular, and I need to know the geography, because did this building exist in that year? That makes a huge difference if you're doing anything historical related, which is what I like to write.
Yeah, as far as technology goes, I have to know what they can build and what they are, and how they're going to fight each other and stuff like that. Stuff that's salient to the kind of stories I write, you know.
Yeah, you got to figure out how the blood is going to be shed, right, Tim?
Exactly.
Exactly, you know, soul eating sword, not everyone has one of those.
A lot of my stories start out more with character. I'm a very character-driven sort of writer, so I kind of develop the time setting around the characters. One thing that's really important to me is getting the way that they talk and the language that they use correct, because I've read so many books where they have modern speaking and in a historical setting, and it's one of my pet peeves. So that's like I research, when did this phrase come into being, or when would this be happening? How would they feel about a certain event that's happening in their time? So I guess I kind of more go around like the socio-political background of everything that's happening.
Depending if it's like, historical, or if it's like, fantastical but set in a historical kind of time frame, I like to kind of figure out the government of what is going on. So like, if it's a monarchy, which it generally is, because that really informs what the rest of the world is like. So if it is like a monarchy, and then if the monarch is benign or malevolent, or if it's like emperor or whatever like that, or empress, and then it can kind of see what the characters want to do. Then is it their kind of destiny to overthrow this monarchy, or are they working with whoever's in charge? So that's one of the things that I kind of like to figure out. Yeah, if it's more of something that's based in history, real world history, then obviously you've got things that you can draw from, and you want to kind of you want to toe the line a little bit. But if it's just something that's inspired by, then you've got a lot of things that you can pull from.
There's a lot of cool shit in this setting. There you have the castles, you have the costumes, you have the dragons, you have the catapults, you have all the really cool, neat shit that you can jam into this sometimes, depending on how fantastical you're going to get, or how accurate you're going to get. That also probably determines a lot of that as well. And I'm wondering, when does the cool shit start for you all? Are you thinking about, I'm going to put a dragon right here, right now? Or is it kind of something that just kind of goes along with the story and the setting? How does the cool shit come about?
How does the cool shit get here? For me, the cool shit starts with the plot, right? The plot is what really gets the cool shit going. I mean, if I'm going to have magic, I'm going to have fairies, am I going to have what? If we're going to like Game of Thrones, we're going to do with that. That's a lot of political intrigue.
Is it something that you sprinkle in as it goes along, as you're writing then? Or is it something you think about when you're...
Actually, when I write a story, I just write it. Boom, 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 boom. In a way, it's almost like thinking of it like the skeleton. And then I go back and I throw the meat on later. And that's just the way I do it. It's kind of a step. But making the skeleton is first. And then we throw the meat on later. Maybe that's when all the cool shit gets there and the meat gets there. But as you're writing it, things will appear to you. Things will come to you. And I'll keep it in my journal, all the things I want to put in to it. It's going to need to know who am I fighting? What kind of things I'm going to need to fight with them? Are they magic? What races are they? If we're dealing with like a D&D kind of setting. So, and gods. So many gods.
Oh, that's one thing we missed when we talked about the stuff that makes the setting. Because I wanted to mention that is that the fact that what's more powerful than the king in say medieval Europe? That's God. That's the church. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I started there basically when I was creating my Demon Hunter setting. I started with like, oh yeah, what have we got instead of a Vatican in this kind of setting? What did we have instead of a Catholic Church? Because this is a secondary world. I said, okay, well, what if that stuff was real? What if there was something? And why would people be basically paying attention to this giant bully in the sky? And I came up with a bunch of reasons. If they're real, they could really push you around.
Politics and religion, that's what kind of keeps things going. Oh, that's very good.
The same thing in a lot of
in medieval times, yes, it is the same things. I'm reading a book right now about that, actually, and it's fascinating how much religion, because again, I'm a very secular person, so the idea of religion actually getting that ingrained into your everything, it's amazing to me. But that's the way it was. And 1600s were a terrible, terrible time, so it was an absolute shit time to live.
And it wasn't even that long ago.
It wasn't, but it was. It was a shit time to live. Everything was hard and everything sucked.
Politics and religion is pretty entwined in a lot of countries again these days. But
unfortunately.
Yeah, I look at both those things, but I kind of as the opposite to Nikki, where it's like kind of plot where the cool shit comes in. I kind of look at it from character point of view, and I like to kind of break down what is the biggest challenges for each character. Usually because I'm very mean to my characters, I like to figure out what's going to really be like tough for them.
You're the worst god ever.
You are torturous.
I don't know. I'm just seeing some of these gods in fantasy.
And it's usually the ones that I mostly identify with are the ones that I'm the worst to, which is like really, really strange. I need to really kind of talk to a therapist about
that. Yeah. I worked that out too. Yeah.
a big fan of kind of taking things from that has happened in history and kind of putting my own spin on it, like especially battles and stuff like that.
Yes.
I really like to look at like ancient battles, like the siege of Carthage and all this kind of stuff, and like kind of look at all the tactics and look at what happened and kind of like go, well, if you put magic into this,
right,
how would it be different? If you put this, if you dropped a dragon into the middle of this, even though I don't ever write about dragons, weirdly enough. But if you did, what would happen?
If you're writing the fantasy, historical fantasy, you've got more leeway. If you're writing historical romance or historical anything that's not fantasy, you don't. So if you're setting it in 1200 or 1300 something, you have to match the time or your readers are going to be very upset. Mm-hmm. And those things that happened were very big part of the characters' lives. So your story really wouldn't fit if you get too wild with what you want to do and changing a lot of that. With fantasy, though, you've got a little bit more room. For me, for a story, no matter the genre, must start with the heroine. She appears to me first, and she's got a big problem. So it doesn't matter what the genre, what the time frame, that's how I start. Without that, I have no story to start.
I think mine mostly is character driven. What can I do to make the character more interesting, or how can I connect them to another character? So if I'm in the research phase and I find something really cool, I'm like, well, that might be something that I could connect to this other thing that's going on. I am not a very big plotter. I have a very, very sparse skeleton. There's like 5 bones on the skeleton. That's how I do it.
That's all you need.
Yeah. So as I build it, I think of stuff, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
So am I the only one here who's setting first when it comes to story building? Because I definitely am setting first. Like, I can't build characters without knowing the setting a little bit. I
need to know both. I need to know
where
I'm putting my guy, and then where's the setting, and then I need to know, the people. I gotta balance the two.
Yeah, characters are a very close second for me, and they kind of grow at the same time, but I need the seed for the setting first, or don't know who's going to be in it.
Oh, yeah. I need to know where I'm at.
I'll do a loose setting, like, time frame, setting, genre, subgenre, whatever, and then, once that's there, then I do the characters, and then the rest of it grows from that, really, But yeah, there is always some kind of setting that's done first.
It sounds like genre is very important to set up.
Yeah.
Like this too, right? You have to know what genre you're building into.
Exactly.
Yeah, but can I push back on it just slightly? Because there's some very popular media out there, maybe not books. I mean, if you're writing the actual historical genres in fiction, is the standard higher than something like Hamilton, Bridgerton, or any of those things that are like not very historically accurate in a lot of ways, or they don't talk like they did back then, that kind of thing?
I think it comes down to presentation. So if you're presenting it as something like that, like Hamilton, very much is modernized. If it comes across that it's going to be that way from the start, but if you just jump into something thinking it's going to be straight historical, then it can get on someone's nerves.
Right. I mean, they've done that with Shakespeare. They've got the original, and then they've got, this is the modern take on, or like A Knight's Tale, where they all break out into modern dance and dance around. If you know what you're getting into, then you're not upset about it, right?
Yeah, and another great example that actually is from Shakespeare, writing about ancient Greece, because his ancient Greek characters are very much like English characters from his own time. And so he's not worried about, whatever in Troilus and Cressida, the Trojans acting like Trojans. They act like English people,
Your average groundling's not going to have an ancient history, education. They're not.
I mean, he did have Homer, though. He
knew, but
But yeah, it's true. Nobody else cares. And how is he supposed to put Greek theater on stage in his period? It's the limitation of his technology and stuff, his resources.
Just don't leave the Starbucks cup out.
Yeah, don't leave your Starbucks cup out on the.
and then it came full circle because Baz Luhrmann did a modern take on Shakespeare, who did modern takes on previous stuff as well. So there is that subgenre of modern takes on stuff that are classics and what have you.
So I'm curious, because times of yore, there is often times when I've seen a lot of, especially in epic fantasy, a lot of time passes by, right? So I'm curious about how you handle seasons. Is seasons a thought process in your structuring of your settings? And how much does that play a role in the story itself?
Yeah, I've just been doing that recently in my epic fantasy, whereas like, especially when it came to warfare, because obviously like a lot of in the olden days, as our days of yore, people didn't really go to war during winter. So like people used to just have a little rest when it came to winter. They're like, well, we'll be fine for a few months. We'll get back to that in spring. And then they'd wage war from spring to autumn, and then they'd take a little break again. And it makes sense why it's difficult to kind of move armies and feed them and do all this kind of stuff. I think we probably have to mention like Arthurian legend at some point as
Oh yeah, we need to. Yeah.
And like obviously with the seasons with that, depending on what take of Arthurian legend you were looking at, if you're looking at like kind of Bernard Cornwell or someone like that, who was looking at a very kind of militaristic kind of way and almost like a historical fiction as much as possible. It was more like that kind of seasons as in waging war and how things function. But if you look at other ones that were like Stephen Lawhead or even Mallory or people like that, they took seasons as being a much more figurative and spiritual system, and tied it in with the land and the health of the characters as well, and even in the story, how they kind of structured a story. Arthur's story is told as a seasonal way. He has his spring, summer, autumn, and winter, and then obviously he has the winter is the end of his life, and then whatever happens afterwards goes back into spring again for rebirth potentially in the future. So a lot of like kind of like older mythological stories, like especially ones that were originated in the British Isles, would treat seasons as a figurative thing that was like a metaphor for an allegory for life in general, and would apply that to stories.
Seasons are very, very important, so you can tell the person where they are, what happened. Because you're putting your characters up against even more plights and problems when you're dealing with winter and all the things.
I wanted to mention the Society of Creative Anachronism, which is also known as SCA. And I'm a member, and what we do is we recreate old times, but with a little bit of a modern twist, because you've got to be able to live. And so we go primitive camping, and we make the garb, the clothing of the time, and we cook outside on fires. And, it's an eye-opener when you're trying to write this kind of thing. I shoot a Mongolian horse bow, which is a wooden bow, wooden arrows. It's cool. Great fun, and I've learned some medieval dances, and my persona is Annabella from the 12th century Karlovarok castle. So I've been doing this for years, and it's great fun. But as far as weather goes, so if you're outside in a tent, the weather is very much a part of what you do, and you must get your bed off the ground and insulate it somehow, because otherwise the ground gets cold and you get cold. Yeah. Just all these things that you learn. It's our modern society that has people staying inside all the time.
Oh yeah.
Even look back through your family line. I mean, even your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents, they were definitely outside more than we are now. And so that outdoors is a very much part of their life. So, and of course, if they're growing food or they're doing any of those things that must be done outside, they're going to be outside a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the seasons play a big part in each of the DeviantArt books so far, but each one is just in a different season, because there's relatively short time spans for each one. So the first one is in summer, then the next one's autumn, bleeding to winter, and then the last one's basically all winter currently. I say the last one, the latest one.
I don't deal much with actual like seasons as thematically or anything like that. I mean, they do affect, if my character is celebrating a certain holiday, or the clothes that they wear, or things like that, where they're traveling, how they're traveling. But I don't know. A lot of my stories are set within short time frames. One of mine is literally set within a day, so it's not something I've had to tackle very much.
Even with seasons, it's like daylight comes into it as well, with people's habits of what they do, because obviously in older days, people would, in the summer, they'd wake up earlier and they'd stay awake for longer, and then during the winter they'd sleep more. than they would do in the sun because it was darker, and
Yeah.
they didn't have as much fuel to kind of like for candles and for everything else and for heating to stay awake, so they would go to sleep. So you would have like the humans, especially in like kind of medieval. We don't really call them the Dark Ages anymore, but like the medieval times and what have you. People will just almost hibernate, so in fact they'd be awake for about 6 or 7 hours a day. That's what they would do.
Yeah, conserve food, conserve energy.
Right.
So yeah.
And that's all the kind of things that if you want to do like setting and you're doing historical fiction, like that's the kind of things that you kind of really have to bring into mind, because you wouldn't have people in the middle of winter just going off on big adventures and doing things. It was didn't happen. People just stayed where they were pretty much for months on end until spring came again, and then people started doing things. Usually killing each other is what they used to do in spring.
There's a big picture setting in the world, the climate, terrain, social, political, history, religions, etc. And there's small detail settings on how a room is decorated, layout of the room in the castles, how it smells, what type of food is nearby. Do you feel one is more important than the other?
Yeah, because a castle in itself is actually a city. If people who live within a castle, it's almost like a little city. We'd consider a city now. People live within the castle walls. When I was in Italy once, and we went to a castle that the family still lives in. They still kind of stay there, and they have like these big barbecues. They had this big kitchen, and there was like gunk on the walls. It was about this thick on the walls, and that's all like residue and grime and fat stuff from hundreds and hundreds of years. It's fascinating. So back to the question, I think it's very important. I think both are important. To know how a castle is, understand how the world works in a castle, but also how they lived, what they had. Beds. Beds are fascinating. Beds, we take beds for granted. Yeah. Only the rich and the wealthy had beds. Your average Joe slept on the floor on some hay. You whatever you can possibly get, because you don't want to sleep on the ground because the earth it'll just make you cold. So the earth is a vampire. So yeah, it'll just suck you dry. So both. It's both. Actually, the whole bloody damn thing is all very important.
They're both really important. And the thing is as well, when you start, especially if you get into the smaller details, you really have to make sure that they're making logical sense as well. Like if you have a setting which is like wintry enough, so like a Northern England kind of setting, which a lot of fantasy is generally, medieval Northern European, right? But then if you have that as your setting, as your inspiration, and then you have people eating olives.
Yeah, no.
Then you have to kind of figure out, well, where are these olives coming from, right?
Yeah.
Because they're obviously not growing them around here. And if they're in, like, as you say, like in a little kind of castle city, which will have walls, people will have to go out to find them. And if it's olives, they're going to be going quite a long way. So they say, well, they must be trading with someone. So what's the way that people used to trade in those days? Would be by boats. That's the safest way of doing it, because it would take so long overland. So, are they close to a river? Most cities would be next on a river or on the sea or whatever. So these are the things that you kind of have to pay attention to. And if you ignore these things, one or two of them you can get away with, I think, because you're caught up in the story, you're caught up in the setting. It's not our world, unless you are doing historical fantasy. But then if they all start kind of stacking up these little inconsistencies and these little kind of logical things that aren't checking out, they start to become bigger in the mind, and then the world doesn't feel authentic. And that goes if it's a completely second world fantastical setting. It goes if it's something that's set in Normandy in the 13th century. Otherwise, you'll get people asking questions or being pulled out of the story, which is the thing you don't want to happen.
Right.
I get pulled out when I see somebody's got a kilt on a person that during that time period they weren't wearing kilts because it was restricted. So there's certain years that you didn't have people walking around in kilts. Right. Or if you go over there today, even in modern day, when the men over there today are not running around in kilts. You might see it at the tattoo. If it's at the tattoo, you're going to see kilts. But, you might not see it any other time, weddings or something, right?
Right.
I agree. You need to have both. Small details let you know more about a character. It lets you know more about your setting and how they're moving through the setting and how they're advancing through the plot. But you don't need to maybe go down to like a Tolkien-esque sort of view where you've got 10 paragraphs about a tree. It should be a mix. You want your reader to feel like they know the place that the character is, so they can visualize it in their head. But you don't want to have too many things also that you have to go back and make sure are right. You don't want to make more work for yourself. So I try to keep it not too vague. I want them to be able to picture it, but I don't want to have to remember what flower pattern I put on a plate like 10 pages ago.
Yeah.
So keep it simple but interesting.
Thou shalt not bore your reader, and you will bore your reader with way too much.
Or you'll confuse them.
Moving.
What if the pattern of flowers on a plate turned out to be important? 10 pages different. Later, that's a little detail that people need to be aware that was important to begin with, or they're going to forget. That's the kind of example. It's like that. It's going too deep.
So it's interesting if you are doing things that are more modern, to just go back and look at the days of yore and to kind of see where these and chart them and see the expectations, the archetypes and all this kind of stuff.
Tropes.
Yeah,
but even in a fantasy setting, that's also really cool, because then you can look back and see what would people be thinking about in their world that's similar to our world if you're looking at a setting that has a past.
Yeah, but
pretty much all of them do, don't they?
Because we're still just humans. We're not any different than they were back then. We have not evolved into something different.
Yeah.
We still the same needs, wants, and desires, hatreds, and loves that they did. That's why Shakespeare has existed. That's why Shakespeare's stories still resonate, because he wrote about normal, everyday things. Most of his stories. But that's why they can be adapted to modern tellings.
Recently, I was reading a fairly old heroic fantasy book, just like in the 70s, but they said there was an army of 500,000 people. I'm like, they're barbarians, so they don't have any support network. I'm like, yeah, that's not doable. Not with the setting we've seen so far. That's an insane number of people. And it's supposed to be a horde, but geez, especially because they're probably all supposed to be on horseback, I think, which is. Can you imagine they each have 2 or 3 horses? If we're looking at if they're anything like Mongols anyway, it's like, okay, so they have like 1 million horses. Have you ever seen 1 million horses in one place? Okay, well, that number is obviously it feels like an ancient Roman embellishment. It doesn't feel like a real world.
Yeah, because population wasn't that big.
No.
Like when the Magna Carta was signed in England, and there was a population of 2.5 million people in the British Isles. And by the time when the Puritans went over to the New World 200 years later, there was 4.5 million people, right? So it wasn't like a lot of people around, right? So like 500,000 people in an army is quite a huge part of that population.
Right. No, this is a nation. This is not an army. This is an entire nation
this is
marching
a floating nation.
Yeah, exactly.
And then with your horses, how far can the horse go in a day? Because a horse...
Yeah.
Whatever era, a horse can only do what the horse can do. So find out what the horse is capable of.
Just imagine how much horse manure that would be.
Oh, can you imagine?
Yeah.
In the days of yore, the average living age is about 42 years old, right? So
you're ancient at 55, something like that. You're like, you're a venerable,
I'm an old wise
elder at that point.
Awesome.
Yeah, and like child rate of child death was like what?
Oh God, babies just died.
Yeah,
babies just died.
So it's one of these things. Sometimes you read them where it's like some grandparents are like doting over their 12 children. And it's like,
we've explored the Kingdoms of Yore, everybody, and with that being said, we're headed to the high seas for the next time.
Huzzah!
Ready? Because here comes the Kraken.